Okay. We're about ready to get started. I've shared into our recording space for YouTube, and I've shared into our Facebook page. We're a couple minutes ahead of start time. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so we can work with the slides. Evelyn, were you able to catch up from the first session with the Facebook Live that we posted? And do you need me to unmute you to say something? I'm going to unmute you. Are you good to go, Evelyn?
Yes.
Awesome. Feel free to use the chat box for questions or things that you need. Our experience last time was some people came and went through the Zoom, and a lot of people watched us. Well, I don't know about a lot, but some other folks watched us through the Facebook Live. So I'm about to share my screen so we can look at our slides, and we'll get started in a couple of minutes. Okay. Okay, I had us at about slide 40 when we left off. Is that about right, Chris?
Yep, I think so. And I think Germany goes first. Is that correct?
I believe so. Yep.
Okay.
So we'll give it about 2 more minutes before we get started. Is there anything that you want to remind us about what we left off with last week in part 1?
Oh, I suppose so. Is this the start time, or do we need to wait a little bit longer for people?
We're at 6:29. You can tell us something else if you want. How's everybody getting along during this time?
Oh, I think my family's okay. I just did find out today a good friend of mine has breast cancer, so I'm a little bit rattled tonight.
Yeah.
But you know, they're getting better at treating that, so
That's good news. Well, love to everyone who is joining us and everyone who has someone they're concerned about tonight. I think that's a lot of us right now.
yeah.
Okay. So we
Okay.
left off. Yeah, we're at 6:30. So go ahead, Chris. Tell us where we left off last week.
Well, last week we went through one was the nature of the threat as known by scientists and how scientists know that. And we went through the propaganda campaign paid for by the oil industry over 20-some years that obscured and deflected a large part of the American population, if not the rest of the world, mostly us. And then we examined how dire the threats were and what the turning points would be using geologic sciences, telling us that the current projections are fairly dire for the loss of species in humans, but it's not yet anywhere close to a total extinction like the Great Extinctions. And then, after scaring people about all that and getting through the science information, we looked at solutions mainly. And we covered the main things that governments normally do. And then we mentioned number 7, which is in the presentation last week, is the totally mobilized transition to a green economy. And that's what Germany has done, and that's what we're going to touch on tonight. I ended last week by covering the most interesting possibilities that exist in what's called geoengineering. That's dramatic, major changes to the Earth's land, atmosphere, and that being to stop global warming or to consume CO2. And so we kind of ended up with something pretty exciting called the Sahara Forest Project. And this gave people hope, because there is hope. There's a considerable amount that different nations are doing. And Germany is probably the leading example we look at tonight of a nation like from number 7 last week, that's of an effort to create over a 20-year period a total mobilization to move to a green economy. In the United States, this came up in our politics the last year like gangbusters in something called the Green New Deal that Bernie Sanders proposed. And there is another example of a nation moving very quickly that resembles the Green New Deal that Sanders brought up, and that's China. And that's been the last 10 years. Probably will not go through China tonight. We'll probably look at Germany, and I'll summarize them. Here you have the slide that says, which is the main point, they've gone very, very far. That you can go back almost 20 years when they began passing many, many acts, laws, creating a national plan, revised in recent years nearly every year, that totally mobilizes their economy in different sectors to be green, well, basically by 2025 or 2030 at the outset. So you see here some things that just tell you how far they've gone with a lot of different laws. Phasing out nuclear, and tonight I will describe just probably mainly Germany and a little bit of the Green New Deal, and see if people have questions about that. So I guess next slide. Oh, okay. Well, of course, it's the Climate Action Plan, 15 total laws since 1976. Don't need to click on any of these links here, but they do cover the details of this pretty dramatic climate action plan. Now, I think the difference between Germany and even the EU, which Germany is under, is that they went so much further in these various laws, um, covering many sectors of the economy, and all those things that have to do with regulating and stiff fines and taxes on greenhouse gas emissions and the use of fossil fuels, generates huge amounts of money in the national budget for subsidies to speed up the development of green energy all across the board in the country. And what's involved here, of course, are lots of regulations that are set by the parliament and then negotiated with what's called the Landwehr, the regional governments of Germany. And you see here a listing uh, of all these areas, 15 impressive areas: energy saving, consumption, product labeling, renewable energies, conservation industry, the electric heat and power industry, renewable energy, biofuels, the power grid. All of these would be single items that we talk about maybe doing something about in the United States and almost never get around to. Grid expansion, carbon capture and storage, electrical cogeneration, the banning of fracking. Many, many pieces of um, the economy year after year in a cooperative endeavor between scientists, the federal government, and industry representatives working toward the overall plan instead of fighting each other in the national legislature like we see in the United States. The American Council for Energy Efficient Economy ranked Germany as the most energy efficient country in the world. So, of course, this is um, well beyond what the European Union uh, agreed to in their climate plans under the Kyoto and now Paris treaties. So Germany kind of leads the way in all these sectors. Okay, next slide. All right, you have the German Federal Ministry for the Environment is kind of like the American EPA on steroids. Huge annual budget, 5.7 billion euros. Many ministries that have powerful teeth in regulating industries, and many goals and regulations that stretch out to 2050. 16 regional governments, and like I said, industry and science boards cooperate. Okay. And the goals being at the bottom of the page, 60 to 80% greenhouse gas reductions by 2030 to 2040. Now, a single example of how that's achieved is the German goal to reduce fossil fuel personal transportation by 2025. All vehicles will be electric by then. And that's, of course, not anything close to what we're doing here. So 60 to 80% reduction of greenhouse gases by 2030, now increased to 55% by 2030 in recent laws. And you see they just keep stepping up their regulations and their subsidies and their control of different sectors of the economy. Specific sector targets. Now, when you talk about sectors, you're looking at things like this. Everything in energy generation, all buildings in the country, all forms of transport, every element of industry and manufacturing, and agriculture. So cutting by 2030 versus 1990, the current funding and programs and regulations and taxes seek to cut CO2 emissions in these different sectors within the next essentially 10 years. Minus 61% in all energy, minus 66% in building, minus 40% in transport, 49% in industry, and 31% in agriculture. In total, the CO2 emissions will be cut by 55% in 10 years. And then totally greenhouse gas neutral by 2050. Okay, now this slide and the next one kind of outlines how they're achieving this by using green energy, regulation, taxes, subsidy, those different things. They chose quite a while back to phase out nuclear power as an option. Some of this discussion dates all the way back to the Chernobyl disaster in 1986. Then the Japanese power plant disaster here, 5 years ago, really did secure that idea that Germany was not going to be investing in nuclear power. Another major goal is to end the use of coal in all generation of electricity and replace them with different forms of gas turbine plants that use biofuels. Now, Germany, for instance, has a strong biofuel subsidy and development program that amounts to huge amounts of grants to farmers to turn over plant stock that can be used to generate something like ethanol. Rye is a big element um, in their biofuels. And biofuels are supposed to be greatly accelerated in the next 10 years as a replacement fuel for everything in transportation, electricity, buildings, and agriculture. Now, there is a world um, precedent for this. If you back up 25 years, Brazil pioneered in the development of ethanol as a replacement for gasoline and diesel fuel in Brazil, such that more than half of their transportation fuels over the last 25 years were due to sugarcane generated ethanol industry that that wiped out. It uses more than half of the fuel sources, ethanol based fuels in Brazilian transportation. Germany looked at this and said, let's proceed with this the last 15 years. So really biofuels is a major element. It's not just solar and wind, it's the development of biofuels as a replacement for uh, fossil fuels. Okay. And Germany also greatly accelerates wind power. We went past that. Um, Hydroelectric, and all industries must replace the use of oil with biomass fuels by 2030. So they're, shall we say, stomping on the gas pedal about biofuels. Whereas in the United States, no, not the case. We're doing some development of wind and some development of solar, but we don't have a national plan like this at all. Okay.
Chris, do you want to do questions later or as we have them?
We can pause to see if anybody has a question.
Well, I know that I just was curious about what do you think is the thing that keeps us from investigating biofuels more in this country? Is it just industry um, barring that, or is there some other um, less corporate greed oriented answer?
I think my answer coming out of Germany is that they aimed for this a good almost 20 years ago. And you subsidize research and development in industry toward biofuels for 20 years. Now, the only time we really ever came close to that was in 1978 when we had the second oil uh, shock to the economy. The first one is in 1973. And when Carter was president, 1978 energy conservation law was passed, and it was an excess profits tax on oil companies. But during those oil price embargoes, which jacked up the price of oil 3 times. Oil companies were ripping off the country by increasing prices at the gas pump. So the excess profit tax created an energy trust fund that was supposed to create something like $450 million in the first year and continue on into the 1980s to be a grant program to develop solar and wind and alternative energy fuels. However, 1981, Reagan canceled that with his tax cuts. You see how that is an example of what we tried and failed and demolished. But the Germans were building these subsidy and grant programs for biofuels for some 20 years. So the technologies are developed, highly developed, and expanding quickly, and we've never gone there. We just rely on somebody getting a patent for an invention or testing something out at the university or something like that. And then will it go profitable on the market? Will it can it gain financing from banks? Those are all picayune, minor, extremely minor ways to innovate and to stimulate the development of a new fuels industry. Not anything like Brazil, not anything like Germany. We're just apparently incapable of using public policy to fund things like this with trust funds.
Got it. Well, that's helpful and sad at the same time.
Yeah. Okay, big spending increases seem to come along about every 2 years in this total green economy mobilization plan. 600 billion euros in 2019 to approximately 6.3 increased as a total amount. A vast increase in biofuels production, reforesting, which they do in Germany, carbon cover crop and sinks in farms through subsidies where farmers will essentially grassland or plant shrubbery in and retain the soil. Organic and soil carbon capture that way is a significant way to capture CO2 in the atmosphere. There is some funding of technical storage technologies for power plant emissions and things like that, but most of it is based on soil and organic carbon capture in fields, in agriculture, and reforesting. Cogeneration and power grid update, electrical vehicle, green rail and shipping transport, offshore wind energy, efficiency requirements for products like your washing machine, and the banning of fracking, 3.4 billion per year increased from 2 billion per year. And of course, what we get in the United States is none of this. And we get recent years, the Trump administration canceling the clean power rulings and regulations of the EPA, and just last week, suspending all environmental regulation, which is like the diametric opposite of this kind of policymaking. Our stuff even reverses what are 40-year commitments to environmental quality and pollution regulation.
Wow.
This has been obscured by the coronavirus crisis because it was just last week that the EPA suspended all environmental regulation. Now, normally, this would have gotten huge, huge major coverage on TV and the outrage of environmental groups. You don't hear anything about it at all right now. So we talk about diametric contrast. It's just insane.
Wow, Chris. Okay, we'll go to the next slide and see what we got there.
Oh, yes, your private household. Uh, okay, these are examples. Massive installation in your house. Drift away from fuel oil and natural gas heat to biomass gas sources or electric heat, which is generated increasing really by wind and solar. Passive solar heat elements in your private household. Uh, and there's strict requirements for this, right? You must do these things. In the business, retail, commercial, I think your shopping malls, your city building. A strict switch to renewable energies and conservation similar to housing. I talked about this last week, that the richest, lowest hanging fruit in reducing greenhouse gas emissions across the world are available in conservation, energy conservation measures in the use of in the heat and consumption of fossil fuels in buildings. So think of all the air conditioning in buildings, all the heating in buildings, all the ventilating in windows that could be secured and not leaking. We don't have very high requirements in the United States. In Germany, they're extreme requirements. And that's because they instantly uh, both reduce expenses on energy. At the same time, they instantly reduce greenhouse gas uh, emissions and reduce the requirements for power generation. So it's not just your private household; it's all commercial, all retail buildings. Transport by 2030, shift entirely to biofuels, biofuels, and rail transport, which of course is really big in Europe, and reduce freight trucking and increase subsidies to rail travel and rail freight industries. Mandatory fuel efficiency regulations and CO2 reductions for all motors and all vehicles and modes of transport. That's rail, that's buses, that's airplanes. So again, the idea that government policy can be a mix of things, taxes, regulations, subsidies. Well, you combine that into entire economic sectors and every year increases both the regulations and the subsidies for all sectors of the economy to go green. Now, here's a few things. All existing and resold buildings must be retrofitted to zero greenhouse energy by 2030. You have a building and you're selling it, commercial, real estate, high rise, skyscraper, it doesn't matter. All new government, private homes, all new, all new and government buildings have to have zero greenhouse energy by 2030. All electric power generation must be 25% across the nation generated by renewable energies. And that's again not nuclear, that's solar and wind and biofuels, the third element, right? Okay, in 2020, the CO2 motor vehicle tax for old inspected vehicles, because not everybody has brand new vehicles. I sure don't. Um, Inspected vehicles have to increase if they are tested for CO2 emissions. The tax on that increases by 100% in 2020. Another thing, of course, is across the EU is organic farming, widespread in the EU, European Union. The EU, based on the EU definition of what organic raised products mean, and that means, and that those are high standards for non-GMO, which of course keeps out embedded pesticides in grains. But here in Germany, you define what percent of your land is going to be arable, that's organic farm based. 20% of arable land is supposed to was supposed to be installed in 2012, up from 4% in 2006, and 50% of all arable land in Germany will be organic, with massive subsidies for biofuels and alternative organic fertilizers, not petrochemical. So instead of organic farming being voluntary and you get a loan and you work on it yourself and you're a small organic farmer, no, this is the drive to change the entire agribusiness sector to organic farming using biofuels and organic fertilizers across the country, 50% of the land by 2030. I don't think I will try to summarize the elaborate eco-financing law, other than to mention that it's there, but here's a couple elements of it. Eco tax, a corporate profit tax on resources that are resources wasted, not meeting efficiency and CO2 regulations. The federal environmental ministry has a very powerful inspector force that goes around the country, constantly monitoring um, waste and emissions, controlled emissions in all industries. So you tax energy consumption with an eco tax enforced by an inspector force. And then tax reductions are allowed for producers and firms and businesses that are complying speedily with the national laws. And the last element there, emission traders, that is, I talked about this last time, is that some of the laws in the EU following after the Kyoto Treaty were to set up in economic sectors cap and trade um, methods. That means if industries were to comply and spend a lot of money on being green and clean, then those businesses are given a tax break in the national economy as long as they exchange their technologies with competing industries that would be fined for polluting. So those companies that did this under the Kyoto Treaty and German laws are exempt from an energy consumption tax. Because why? Because they're building their efficiency through a cap and trade system. Now, in the United States, we have cap and trade in the Northeast states and in the Northwest states and in the individual states of Washington, Oregon, and California. Because we never passed an emissions trading law, though we came close to it. I think it was in 2014, but we didn't. So we don't have a national cap and trade emissions trading. You get a tax break if you help your competing industry go green, and then they don't get fined. And that's how that would work if we had ever passed a national law, but we didn't. But California did, Washington did, Oregon did, and for electrical generating plants, this was an interstate treaty, a treaty between states in the Northeast New England states and in the Pacific Northwestern states, which included the province of British Columbia in it in the Northwestern states. Why am I saying that? To show you what the heck we didn't do and what the Germans did. Yeah, don't know how far I want to go with China because I kind of wanted to feature Germany as this dazzling example of a country that tried for 20 years to go totally green in what we would call the Green New Deal, only they've already done it for 20 years, and accelerating it in Germany. China has made some changes in that fashion, and if we have any time or interest, I'll come back and look at
I just went forward to slide 62 where it looks like you begin the information about the Green New Deal. Is that where you want to move to?
That's kind of where I want to move to. I can go back and talk about China maybe.
Okay.
The Green New Deal, of course, was a long percolating series of proposals in Europe and in the United Nations and among ecological researchers and economists, green economists across the world. And Sanders got together a still mysterious team. I don't know who they were, to kind of review these various proposals across time and come up with a proposal that he would run. And you've probably heard him talk about it as he was campaigning. And he wouldn't say it exactly, but to do what Germany's doing or some of these other transition mobilized green economies are doing. Because it's being done elsewhere doesn't mean it can't be done here. And the crisis in the sixth extinction, the threats, the climate crisis is so severe that without following the lead of proposals like this in countries like Germany, we're never going to be able to slow down the increase in greenhouse gases and stave off the extinctions. So the Green New Deal was discussed in our Congress and proposed by Bernie Sanders. And basically, you can go back to this guy, Lester Brown, who's the leading ecologist in the world that developed a kind of transition plan over 20 years. So why is it weird? Because it's in the United States, due to the power, the lobbying power of so many industries with a stake in not changing. We hear all the time that the Green New Deal is infeasible, can't be paid for. How are you going to do that? It's impossible. It's dreamy. But of course, that's pretty much crazy because it leaves out the rest of the world that is, in fact, doing exactly that. Okay. So I thought it was worth going through his proposal because you just finished looking at Germany and to examine how it's kind of similar and maybe a little bit different than Germany, but it would move us in the German direction. I think probably with Bernie not being the leading Democrat and with the coronavirus pending great recession, who knows how bad it'll be, I wouldn't be too surprised, even we do manage to get progressives and Democrat control in the Congress, that it would be, wow, a stretch to fund all these proposals while we're trying to recuperate our healthcare system and restore the damage to our economy. But we'll see with the coming election. Let's take a look at the Green New Deal and compare it to Germany as we go. Oh yeah, it's illuminating to compare it to Germany because we are largely unaware of the German or the Chinese efforts. And it's nothing like the real world to tell you that the Green New Deal is pretty real, actually, and might actually work. Well, that's because it's basically proven and feasible because it resembles what is already done, especially in advancing in Germany. So the brain shift that it requires among politicians as well as citizens is that with the Chinese being the greatest polluting economy, moving quickly to green, the US comes in next as the second most polluting greenhouse gas economy that's not doing it. And to bring the plan up here in our campaign actually is quite interesting because the one Bernie proposed may in some ways go past what Germany has planned for. And if we could, as the second most greenhouse gas polluting economy do this thing, we might be able to combine with other countries to reverse global warming. What is a unique feature is that it's not just about green economics. It's about Bernie's plan is also putting in many features that go beyond what's in Germany, but might resemble German, you call it socialist policies. That is, eliminating economic injustice, environmental destruction, public health problems, poverty at the same time. It is really interesting to look at his plan because he did not incorporate a carbon use tax, which is talked about so much by economists. Tax carbon, then people won't use carbon, won't use fossil fuels. His plan did not contain a general carbon use tax. Germany did. So I think what is controversial, at least in this country, is that his plan would rely entirely on renewable energy sources, and I would mention solar and wind in this regard, and then maybe in biofuels, not as much as Germany. Okay. And as his plan says, we don't rely on any false solutions like nuclear. And see, he cuts out geoengineering, which I covered last week, or carbon capture, industrial carbon capture um, in manufacturing. So some unique elements here. Okay.
Chris, why would he cut out geoengineering?
The geoengineering proposals have never really received incorporation into global treaties or national uh, green economy conversion plans, with a couple of exceptions. The organic farming stuff, the reforesting, the biofuels, those would come into geoengineering. You may recall last week I ran a quickie on let's, what if you could entirely green the Sahara Desert across North Africa? Well, uh, the the changes proposed by the geoengineering ideas are usually debated among environmentalists as having very unknown, because they're massive proposals, unknown environmental costs, right? So,
Right.
in that kind of debate, no nation's ever really gone for those dramatic ideas yet in their national plans. But because, like I said last time, the world treaties and the national plans aren't really reducing greenhouse emissions and warming enough, we're probably approaching the time when we really ought to be looking at this stuff. And Bernie Sanders does not either.
Wow. Okay. Well, that's interesting to note. I'll take you to the next slide.
Yep. Okay, the two primary drivers of the plan include his details on his proposals for a high living wage, full employment, renewable energy economy. That's covered in the slides that come. The second driver of the plan is a new green agribusiness system that essentially reverses the entire agribusiness complex and university-based extension systems and laws and subsidies that kind of sped up and were set up after World War II in the United States. We have a land management system, conservation and stuff like that, that goes back to the 1930s under the Dust Bowl. But you combine those two things, and we have a, fossil fuel heavy petrochemical industry, massive farming system, and that would be phased out entirely by a new green agriculture and land management system with little or no use of fossil fuels, and major changes in the way soils and forests and wetlands are treated in the U.S. It's also a giant conservation proposal. All right, so you can see some breathtaking stuff here. Our Congress just passed a $2.2 trillion economic recovery thing. Before that ever went through, he was the only one out there talking about $840 billion to change the farming system up, down, and sideways into an equitable family farm based system that uses conservation and organic and soil regenerative and cover crop uh, carbon capture and get rid of the climate destructive factory farm food meat based heavy petrochemical industries. And in this plan, his vision of rural America would so change towards what Germany's doing, would draw down billions of tons of excess CO2, reduce it and store it in soils and pastures, and simultaneously improve food quality, public health, the viability of farms, and the quality of life in farm communities. Yes, it's breathtaking, and no, nobody else is coming close. So here are some of the elements. Would reduce, regulate, abolish, and fine fossil fuels. Let's see. Decarbonizing transportation and power generation, which of course they did in Germany. Cutting in half the two largest sources of emissions in the US. And then the plan aims for the US to become carbon neutral by 2050, which Germany would do, and would go carbon negative thereafter. So Sanders would ban offshore drilling, halt the extraction of fossil fuels from public lands, ban fracking, cease issuing new permits for fossil fuel industry infrastructure like pipelines and refineries, banning the imports and the exports of fossil fuels. See, this is strangling the oil industry, period, and anything based on petrochemical, uh, cousins like natural gas. He would also criminally prosecute fossil fuel companies for the pollution of air, land, and water that they have, you know, fostered for some 30, 40 years. His plan would provide 5 years unemployment insurance, wage guarantees, healthcare, job training, and support to the workers in the fossil fuel industries whose jobs would be eliminated. Okay, now all of this, if he ever got this through with legislation, would be something like what Germany did for 20 years, only he would be trying to do it in 5, right? His plan would amount to a fast mobilized shift to a new green economy in a shorter amount of time than the Germans did it. 16.3 trillion in 10 years. We just did a 2.2 trillion economic recovery. That'd be a 2030 deadline for electricity transport and everything like Germany to be entirely renewable energy, solar, wind, and some biofuels. Now, how's he going to pay for this? Well, a combination of new taxes, fees, and fines and litigation against fossil fuel companies, new taxes on corporations and wealthy people, cuts in military spending related to U.S. use of oil, and he would invest 2.5 trillion in new renewable energy and energy storage, which would be publicly owned, moving away from the private sector. 500 billion in upgrading the electricity grid, more than 2 trillion in grants for energy efficiency and weatherization. For buildings, remember that they did that in Germany. And like in Germany, convert the nation's vehicle fleet, spending 3 trillion to help people and businesses buy electric cars and trucks. And gee whiz, go back to high-speed rail and 900 billion on public transport. So yeah, this is a World War II level mobilization of public funding and private funding and taxing and regulating and fining that would force the economy to mobilize towards all these green economic sectors in a very short period of time, about 10 years.
Wow. That's incredible, Chris.
Yeah, it's an amazing proposal, but it's why is it feasible? Because the Germans did it in 20 years. You know,
Yeah.
I mean, they did it. So to stand around hearing politicians say, "Well, how are you going to pay for it?" and nobody can do it, is to hear a politician or somebody say they don't know a thing about the rest of the world.
Right.
They don't know. They don't know about EU. They don't know about China. They don't know about Germany. They don't know about Brazil. They don't know anything. Okay. Because this has been going on in a rapidly accelerating fashion in different parts of the planet. And they should be called out for their ignorance. But you just, you don't hear, why are the Democrats so nice? Why don't they
Right.
say, why don't you describe, Mr. Republican Big Mouth, what you know about what's going on in Germany with their green economy and watch them not say anything? See?
And why do we have Democrats who aren't even willing to push this, who treat this like it's a super far left something rather than something that's been successful in other countries for a couple of decades now? That's the part that frustrates me. But we digress.
Well, that's true. And I suppose you could point to a whole lot of things. The media doesn't cover it, and it's not taught in our agricultural schools, is it? No. You'd have to major in environmental studies or something like that to even bother to hear about it in college, right?
Right.
Uh, and the Democratic Party is split all the way from eco green radicals to conservative Democrats that don't even want to talk about this. So there's also many reasons why we don't, I think. Um, anyway, just look at this list really quickly. 410 billion for farmers and ranchers to do all this stuff. 160 billion to farmers and ranchers to sequester and increase their soil carbon and crop cover. 25 billion for farmland conservation. Bunch of stuff, 1.25 billion for tribal land access and acquisition for this. 1.4 new research and development for organic best option. From what? From all those increased taxes that were described in previous slides. And as the economy regenerates, he always talks about how, the new people in new green jobs would be paying their taxes, funding these revenue sources in these new industries, wouldn't they? So while sometimes he's not specific how that would occur, it is, of course, standard economics to say that if people are working in jobs and paying taxes, it's going to generate revenue. So they'd have to do some economic modeling to find out how that would go on. But the issue is you about got to do it and stop piddling around with either reversing green policies like the Trump people do, or, spending 5 and 10 years before you ever do anything in legislation. $36 billion to establish victory lawns and gardens. That's called urban gardening. Transform your lawns into food-producing reforested spaces. Increase co-op grocery stores. Infrastructure for on-farm and local food processing. Helping states eliminate food waste and compost organic materials. 500 million to help farmers get certified organic. Funds to incentivize schools to get the kids out and procure eating locally procured, locally produced foods. Oh yes, and the regulations with teeth. Break up big agribusinesses. Ensure farmers are paid a fair price for their products. Reestablish and strengthen the grain inspection packers and stockyards administration going back decades. Ensure farmers have the right to repair their own equipment. Using government resources and legal power to break up antitrust restrictions. Reform patent laws to prevent predatory lawsuits from massive can't see the bottom of that. Okay, let's go to the next slide, I guess. Money goes to small and medium-sized farms, strengthening organic standards like they have in the EU. Country of origin labeling and allowing meat slaughtered at state inspection facilities to be sold across state lines. Pathway to citizens from migrant farm workers, improve their wages and working conditions. Yeah, okay, migrant farm workers.
I mean, I love how he's connected the intersectionality of these issues, that this isn't, he's made it clear that the environment is about
Economic
also
justice.
how we change equity and
Yeah.
access for all kinds of different pockets of our communities that are getting a raw deal right now.
Yep. And if he were elected president and he was preparing these proposals, he would engage God knows how many research institutes and ecological sections of universities, and put it all into some giant package that would go down to the House and the Senate. And it would be like he talks. It would be like the New Deal. The New Deal was spread out over 8 years with year after year after year after year of new kinds of legislation, funding for these projects, and that's what he was calling for, was for the leadership of the country and the country itself to mobilize in the way that we did to fight the Great Depression and the drought in the 1930s. And no doubt the details would come along for these things you see on the screen, but he's setting out the project goals of it, right?
Yeah.
The details would come later. Now, of course, the Republicans would whine and scream and fight and, resist it. But if the Democrats won both sides of the Congress and the presidency too, who knows?
Right.
Okay, so I always ask, how do you pay for this? Revenue streams, here it comes. Increasing employment and income tax revenue, 2.3 trillion. Selling trillions of kilowatt hours of renewable solar and wind energy from new Federal Power Marketing Administration, 6.4 trillion of revenue. Reduce federal government expenditures by slashing military spending by 1.2 trillion. Reducing energy costs, which you can see in buildings energy conservation. So each of these, a trillion here, a trillion there, pretty soon you got a lot of money, right? Sanders' plan also calls to direct the Department of Justice to pursue criminal prosecution of fossil fuel companies. Boy, would that be different, right?
Wow.
Litigation fees, taxes, no more fossil fuel subsidies, polluters to pay for disaster risk bonds,
Sorry.
all that stuff. Yeah. Reducing the need for federal and state safety net spending due to the creation of millions of good paying unionized jobs. Higher income and jobs raises tax revenue. Yeah. And making the wealthy and large corporations pay a higher share. He assumed here that you could do all this and generate 6 trillion in new revenue. You add up all these things in the last two slides, you end up with about 16 trillion bucks. Remember, of new revenue, right? And of course, that's kind of interesting, because what is the size of the total GDP, the American economy? Every dollar of whatever before the collapse lately is about 19 trillion per year, right? So he would talk about generating revenues equal to the entire GDP, right? But he does not call for a general carbon consumption tax. Interesting to me. Yeah.
Wow. Okay, next slide.
This is a progressive dream plan, right? Because you're providing green jobs, economic justice, environmental regulation, all kinds of things, right? 20 million new jobs would come from this in sustainable agriculture, a new kind of civilian conservation corps to help the nation cut emissions and store carbon in soils and protect the small farms. That's what he thinks it would generate, is 20 million new green economy jobs.
Wow. I'm ready. I want to do it.
Yeah. Okay, let's see, some details here. Money would be spent across the economy for all kinds of things, for the 16 trillion, grants for new electric vehicles, funds to help farmers capture carbon in the soil, support for workers in the fossil fuel industry to be job retrained, green energy grants for underrepresented groups like women-owned businesses, women farms, Native Americans, and spent across many different clean and energy climate adapting programs, like 40 billion for Native Americans for and people with disability and the elderly to prepare for climate change, and 200 billion to the United Nations Green Climate Fund to help other countries. Details, details.
Let's see. Oh,
Oh yeah, and 1.5 trillion to deploy renewable energy, wind, solar, biofuels, 852 billion for energy storage, new kind of batteries, 526 billion for an underground high voltage direct current power transmission network upgrading the grid. Details, details, right? All right, this slide just kind of summarizes how Sanders is similar and different from Germany. We didn't cover China, but we might go back if you want. Similar versus different. Well, Sanders is pretty close to what Germany actually has done. If you recall, going back to things I described, Germany did this. Took them 20 years. They're still doing it. Similar, how to Germany? Giant mobilization of a national plan, 10 years, not 20. Bans and decarbonizes from fossil fuels and greenhouse gas emissions. Goes big with solar, wind, and biofuels. Vast subsidy to green agriculture. No nuclear, same thing as Germany. Green infrastructure, power generation. Land and soils, carbon storage. It's all similar to Germany. How's it different? Well, we got bigger under Sanders, crash green labor projects, 20 million new jobs. More transition aid to farmers, to indigenous peoples, to low income. Stronger use of law against fossil fuel companies for pollution. I think Sanders is a little less clear, emphasizing biofuels, geothermal, things like that, and no carbon tax, no carbon storage, like Germany does. And again, Germany is halfway there, more than halfway there to complete all this. And what's different about Germany is they have had, for 20 years, huge cooperation and joint efforts by industry, by regional governments, by scientific experts, all working to create these massive changes in funding and laws. And that, of course, is exactly opposite to what happens in the United States Congress. Huge resistance by fossil interests and cronies. So Sanders would have to be bypassing all that power structure, I guess kind of smashing it to the ground and replacing it with a giant, I don't know, New Deal, right? With new kinds of political coalitions that would outpower these people in the national legislature. Yeah, only if we won a massive election that would support that.
wow. Evelyn, do you have any questions you want to ask at this time since you're on live and can do that?
Can you actually hear me?
Yep.
Okay, well, it said in the corner I had to press down my space bar, so I am. One of the things that hasn't been mentioned is population and the way we sprawl out of our cities, which is very unlike Europe. They're much more contained within their cities. And, they don't have McMansions out in the country everywhere, like we seem to do. So any comments about that? I was just watching a program before this on Channel 11, and they made the statement that in the 1940s, Florida had 2 million people, and they now have 20 million people.
Yeah, right.
We can't keep doing that
Mhm.
and do
Yeah.
these green projects.
In my review of the Sanders plan, I didn't see a whole lot on what you would call urban planning. There's entire graduate schools of urban planning. How do you do zoning? How do you plan urban growth? All that stuff. Using architects, right, to draw plans for buildings and meet all these requirements. So, no, you're right. I mean, to do that, we'd have to dramatically change the way we use land, expand on land, commercialize land, sell and buy land, and do zoning and planning. And I'm sure that'll probably come up eventually because it's always there in green proposals. But no, I didn't see a bunch of that in the Sanders initial plan.
That's a great question, Evelyn. My first degree is in public administration, and I think a lot about exactly what Chris just mentioned, this idea of how we do public how we do land policy, and
Yeah, right.
how we train folks to do that kind of work. And it's interesting how different parts of even our country have clued into this in different ways, right? The multi-use land planning that's gone on in some cities where you've got uh, really an emphasis on creating spaces where you don't need to have a car, and where you've got people's shopping and their living quarters right next to each other, and you have um, just spaces used differently. And that sort of smart growth planning that is so popular, and it clearly is how most of Europe has functioned. Well, some of our big cities have had to use it because they have a crunch on land. They can't just spread out. You go to a
Yeah,
place like Texas, and people look at you like you're crazy if you start to talk about smart growth and multifunction use of land. And
yeah, that's
it
right.
just, you said, Evelyn, they want to have their big old house out, with acreage around it. And it is a very different idea of how we might use land, and how we might plan how we live.
Yeah, and I think we're far from that. And a lot of these ideas that Bernie has um, are going to get huge resistance because of our attitudes towards, this individualism and my rights.
Mhm.
And I get to do what I want to do with my land and those kinds of things
Yeah,
that Germany and some of the EU countries, they're just not like that to start with. It's easier to put some of these laws in place there than some of the things Bernie has proposed, because he's going to get a lot of pushback, or whoever tries this.
oh sure, and a lot of that's controlled through state legislatures. I mean, the control of federal lands is one thing, but you've got states like Nevada that are almost all federal land, and states like Kansas that our public lands are almost all privately owned. And
Right.
all of this is state laws, and
Yeah.
and federal laws applies to public lands. So yeah, I think you guys are right. There'd be like a firestorm of resistance here.
Yeah. I mean, I
Yeah,
could see that one of the ways you start to make your way towards this is what's already started to happen, which is some states um, are able to start to pass some of this legislation and
yeah,
start to do some of these projects in their states. And I think at some point, then you have states competing against other states.
yeah.
Um, some of them become better places to live.
Sure.
Livability, and also, if you can find ways to then be making a profit off of that. I mean, you could begin to shift it, especially if larger states are engaging that. Now, I just want to move to Germany. I think what you've done for me is to make me wish that
Yeah.
I had somehow managed to have my kids stay in Germany when she went to visit so that we could just all go move there because
Yeah.
it sounds great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, public health and everything else is going to be stronger there, as we can sadly see at the moment. Um, I think that a Sanders administration could go to all the blue states governors and the blue states legislatures in the National Council Conference of State Legislatures and in the National Governors Conference and say, why don't you guys come up with your model legislations to how you can kind of control land, urban sprawl, and planning? And we'll support you doing this in regions of the country where your state legislatures would pass this stuff. So you obtain reform in states you can, and then that stuff eventually spreads from state to state rather than trying to pass a national law. All kinds of things changed like that, including, um, well, sadly, abortion rights right now. But you look at, you know, gay marriage 6 years ago, and gee, all kinds of reforms spread through the states by going sideways through states that copycat each other. Um, and maybe at some point, a politician that became a president would learn to work with governments in their own organizations that would promote legislation like this in regions and then make it spread elsewhere. But instead of trying to cram everything through Washington D.C., I don't know. This one's really tough. The federal system in America makes it difficult to make broad changes. And in Germany, which has a federal system and no other European country does, they have 16 different regions. Those guys work together with the national parliament instead of against it or divided in different ways. So you see, it can work differently in different countries. I just think we're kind of, oh my God, I don't know. I'm just not sure how we could ever pull off Sanders' plan all at once, in our federal system.
And that's the problem. We're running out of time.
Right.
We've
Yeah,
got to
we are.
be getting somewhere and not, being timid.
Yeah, we can't be timid. We really can't.
I agree.
And I don't know. I guess I'm feeling like maybe this coronavirus public health disaster will force the politicians to work together somehow, because they're going to have the baby thrown out thrown out with the bathwater if they don't.
Right.
And we see the sad story, of states like Michigan and California and New York not getting enough federal help. Well, God, how's that for a bad pattern of tackling a problem? I would hope we'd be able to tackle climate change like we a bit differently, but I'm not sure we can.
Yeah. Well, did you want to cover anything else today, Chris? I feel like we got to the places you wanted to.
Pretty much. Yep. I want to leave people with some idea of what is actually possible
Yeah.
and is being pursued, even if we don't.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell folks that are watching either later at another time that there was a part one. So if you caught this one first, there's a part one that's posted as a Facebook Live on our Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Topeka site. And I'm actually going to try to see if I can convert the recording I did of that into another YouTube. So hopefully I'll have both sections of this in YouTube by the end of the week. This concludes our time with Professor Chris Hamilton, sharing with us some thoughts about what some opportunities are for us to deal with climate change and why we need to do it. Any closing words for us, Chris?
No, I just hope
Okay.
we all get our act together.
That's right. Me too. Well, this was inspiring for me. I learned a lot. I told my family that I thought I knew a lot, and I learned that I didn't know nearly as much as you do. So I really appreciate you taking the time to share with us. And Evelyn, I'm glad you got to join us live. And anybody else who watches the video later, I hope you are able to share some of the information you learned with other folks.
Thank you both.
Yes, thank you.
Sure.
All right.